Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thaís Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Hello, beautiful humans. Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast. I am your host, and I have a special recording to share with you today of an Instagram live that I did yesterday about the intersection between people-pleasing and the worthiness wound. I wrote a post about this a long time ago that I really liked. It said, the other day, one of my brilliant clients said to me in a moment of epiphany, you know, Thaís, I can't people please and feel worthy at the same time. I can't focus on making other people happy at my expense and be worthy. Something has got to give. I can't do it all. And honestly, she said it just absolutely perfectly. You know, people pleasing is one of the many defenses we employ against our worthiness wound. And the truth is we can either be unconsciously in our defense or healing the wound. Both can't happen at the same time. So whenever we find ourselves sacrificing our needs for others, we will also find ourselves perpetuating the worthiness wound. Ironically, this is what's ironic about this. We think people pleasing others is what gives us worth, but the truth is this defense actually keeps our pain in place. And so if you want to heal the worthiness wound, noticing this defense and exploring what is underneath it is key. And so in this Instagram live that I recorded yesterday, I share some more of my thoughts of people pleasing, the origins of people pleasing, and one really important tool that we can start to leverage to reclaim our sense of self away from this orientation of pleasing others. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this episode. So contact me on Instagram at I am Thaís Sky. And like I said in the Instagram live, Worthy Women Rise, doors close tomorrow. If you're listening to this on Tuesday, August 25th, doors close at 9 p.m., August 26th, 9 p.m. Pacific. We have 2 spots left when I recorded this episode. I don't know how many spots we will have left by the time you listen to this episode. But if you're interested in learning more about Worthy Women Rise, you can go to the website. I highly, highly recommend Worthy Women Rise to all people pleasers. I think this program perfectly supports women in cultivating a sense of self away from the orientation of others. And so if you want to learn more, go to worthywomenrise.com. All right, let's get into the recording. Oh, and one more thing. I actually recorded a whole episode on people pleasing 1 year ago. So I'm going to link that up into the show notes for you all, because it would be interesting for you to hear both episodes and see, one, what has evolved from my learning of people pleasing, and two, some additional thoughts on people pleasing. And I'm also going to link up into the show notes another episode that I did on people pleasing called Making Decisions as a People Pleaser. You may resonate with that one as well. So both of those episodes are in the show notes. Okay, now let's get into the recording. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about people pleasing and the worthiness wound. This was a topic that was very much requested. And I talk a lot about people pleasing in my own work because I have seen how absolutely paralyzing people pleasing can be. And so I want to share some thoughts with you all today about where one theory about where people pleasing stems from. I think it's really important to cultivate an understanding and ground ourselves in developmental psychology. So I'm going to talk about the initial infant caregiver relationship and how people pleasing tends to come from that initial relationship. And then we're going to talk about how that may be playing out in your life now. And then we're going to be talking about a few thoughts I have about what can we do about it now. now as adults, and how can we start to untangle from it so that we feel more spacious in our lives, because people pleasing can be really debilitating. As someone who identifies with this identity of people pleaser, I have seen how painful it can be to continually elevate other people's needs, other people's desires, other people's opinions of me over my own opinion of me. It can be very easy for me to not speak up, not share when I'm hurt by somebody's behavior, because I'm terrified that I'm going to hurt their feelings, right? So protecting their feelings, protecting their perception of me is much more important in the relationship than prioritizing my feelings and my needs. And I imagine if you're here, you're probably experiencing something similar. I also know that people pleasing can play out in a lot of caregiver roles, right? So being the caretaker for other people, playing the role of being other people's moms or older siblings, taking people's emotional well-being on as if it were our responsibility. That may be the mom identity, the mom role that really takes on her children's happiness, right? We see this a lot in relationships where we really take on the happiness of our partners as if their happiness is our responsibility. This plays out in all sorts of different areas of our lives. I mean, I see this in the work environment where we're afraid of speaking up. We're afraid of letting our boss know that we're unhappy because we want to be liked. We don't want to be disappointing to other people. People pleasing can play out in all sorts of ways. And one of the most important things that I just have to start off by saying is that knowing how your archetype of people pleasing plays out is really important. Knowing what areas of your life you tend to see this play out more than other areas is really helpful to know, to be able to then explore what's going on in that particular area of your life that people pleasing is coming up. Right? So right there off the bat, one of the most helpful things that we can do is really know how this plays out in our lives. Okay, so as you may or may not know, I am doing this workshop in honor of Worthiness season, which is a period of time every year where I really focus all of my attention on talking about worthiness and the worthiness wound. The worthiness wound is a concept that I created to spell out this place within many of us that feel really broken and not enough. We feel like we didn't really get the handbook of life, that everyone else gets to feel really significant and prioritized, and we feel deficient and like there's something really wrong with us. I label that place within us as the worthiness wound based on extensive research that I've done over the past 10 years, as well as my experience as a life coach. Over the past 10 years, I've been really fascinated by this space within me that feels like so inadequate, so broken, and in order for me to make sense of it, I started to do a lot of research, and I started to see that so many characteristics that I see within me, I saw within the women that I was working with. And it's really cool to be able to put a name to the worthiness wound, because just in naming it, it can feel less overwhelming. Just to be able to name that the worthiness wound is coming up for us around a particular failure, or the worthiness wound is coming up for us around a particular risk moment, right? We took a risk and now we're really feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed, and that there's something wrong and broken with us. Being able to name those things can be so useful in starting to separate ourselves from the worthiness wound. And so I'm also going to be talking about the intersection of worthiness wound and people pleasing, because they definitely play together and play off of each other. And so I'm doing Worthiness season. I'm doing all of this because doors are open for my signature group program, Worthy Women Rise. Worthy Women Rise is my year-long signature program where I invite women into their own shadow work of healing and integrating their worthiness wound. So it's this beautiful, nourishing container where we're really spending a lot of time together understanding your specific context and the ways in which your developmental psychology has led you to feeling like you can't go after the job you want, you can't run your own business, you can't have the partner that you want, you don't feel expansive within yourself, things feel really crunchy, you notice yourself feeling really overwhelmed by the inner critic, you feel debilitating self-doubt and the sense that you are unable to be your own best friend, right? We work with all of that to cultivate the spaciousness within you to be curious and to be able to sit with anything that comes up. And one of the things that we talk about that is directly related to how we can untangle from people pleasing is learning how to sit with all of who we are and cultivate a sense of self that is different away from other people. And part of how we do that work is by tending to and navigating the worthiness wound. So there are only 2 spots available for this program, and doors close Wednesday night. So if you are interested in learning more about Worthy Women Rise, you can go to worthywomenrise.com. You can learn more. You can submit your application. There are only 2 spots available, which is really exciting. The group that's coming together, just the most incredible women who are going to go on a really supportive journey of learning about themselves and the ways that they can friend and tend to all of their broken, messy parts so they can show up more powerfully in the world. Okay. So let's get into my understanding, how I teach people pleasing, how I understand people pleasing. And in order to do that, we really have to go right into childhood. When I think about people pleasing, I think about an external orientation. So cultivating an awareness of self and other where the other is prioritized over self. I'm looking at my notes over here. And so what leads us to have this external orientation? Well, one of the theories that I think has been really quite popular over the past few years and that I have loved for over 10 years is attachment theory. And one of the things that attachment theory tells us is that one of the most important ways that we develop a sense of self is through our relationship with our initial caregiver, whether that would be a mother, a grandmother, a father. Typically, it tends to be mothers, but not always the case. That initial relationship with our initial caregiver really sets a defining tone in which we understand ourselves and the world. Now, the healthy role, a healthy relationship between, we're going to go with mother, but you can replace mother with any other identity. The goal of a healthy relationship between mother and child is that the child experiences something and communicates that something to the mother. So let's say that the child is extremely upset and disappointed. The child communicates that the only way that the child knows how, through crying, through throwing a tantrum. And the role of the mother is to take on that information that the child is delivering it and to digest it, to make sense of it, to understand it, and then to give it back to the child in a way that the child can then digest and understand. Because as children, we're still learning how to process feelings. We're still learning how the world works. The world is very overwhelming to a child. Expecting a child to be able to understand the world is just not in alignment with how children develop. So the role of the mother, the role of the caregiver is to be that buffer to help the child digest and understand the world. In order for the mother to do this, to be able to digest and help process what is happening to the child with the child, the mother has to be flexible, right? The mother has to be able to attune to the child. I love the word attunement because what it means is to be able to take in the other, to be able to understand the other perspective and to be able to be at that same level with them. Attunement happens all the time. We do that to each other all the time when we can really understand what someone is going through. Maybe we've never gone through something like that, but we can really get to that level where we can just be there with them. So attunement is one of the many really important things that the predominant caregiver can do to their child, where they can say, you know what, I am right there with you. I am letting you into my mind, and then I am going to support you in understanding what is happening in the world. This is a really important developmental dynamic, okay, between child and caregiver. This is what a healthy relationship looks like. There are so many other qualities of healthy relating. There's mirroring, there's nurturing. I mean, there's so many qualities that are important in order for the child to feel like their needs are being met. But this level of attunement is a really important one. When the child continually learns that their needs are going to be met by another and in a predictable way, they start to learn that they can meet their own needs. The narrative that we learn how to meet our own needs by being forced to meet our own needs isn't how we work. We learn how to meet our own needs by having our needs met by the most important person in our lives. Do we see that? That's why the relationship is so critical to understanding ourselves. The way that we understand ourselves as children is in that relationship with the caregiver. That's why I say so often that our relationship with our caregiver mirrors our relationship to ourselves. And odds are a lot of the ways that our parents treated us is how we now treat ourselves and others. If it's not the same, it's the exact opposite. That's a response that's really valid too. I'm going to be the exact opposite of how my parents were for me. Is all of this making sense so far? So what we want to be thinking about then is if attunement is really important, if that initial relationship sets the tone in which the child understands themselves and understands the world, then let's talk about if our mothers didn't give that. And most of us who are people pleasers, who really identify with this idea of being people pleasers, odds are our predominant caregiver did not offer the attunement and the needs that we needed to be met, did not do that. In fact, what we tend to find on a spectrum, I like to see people pleasing as a spectrum from simple people pleasing behaviors, which we can pick and choose from. Like sometimes we can choose to please others, and it's not coming at the expense of self. So that's like a healthy people pleasing. We're loving, we're accommodating others from a space of fullness. And then we have the other level of the spectrum where we are people pleasing, but we're picking and choosing the characteristics of people pleasing, but we're not people pleasers. And then we go further along the spectrum where we are what's called pathological accommodation. A really fancy term to mean that we really identify as people pleasers. Yeah, you guys are going to come with me because I need to get some water for my scratchy throat. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what pathological accommodation is in a minute, but what's really important, oh, there's no water there. What's really important to know about pathological accommodation is that our entire identity is oriented towards the other, whereas the other parts of the spectrum, the people pleaser, but like we're just identify with certain behaviors of people pleasing, there's more spaciousness there, which means odds are that we're able to take in ourselves and the other. With pathological accommodation, the other takes complete precedence. We are totally in this space of accommodating for others. And I want to talk about what that looks like because most of us that are people pleasers kind of fall in that spectrum. So if our mothers, thank you for that. That was important. If our mothers was not flexible and was not able to attune to us, was not able to be flexible enough to change parts of who she is in order to accommodate the child, if that didn't happen, what do you think that the child learns? The child learns that they have to be consistently oriented towards the mother and a very rigid set of beliefs and structures and understanding of the world. If the mother is not flexible in helping the child to digest what's happening, the child is left alone to have to make sense of a lot of things. And so what does the child do when they're left alone to make sense of things that a child's mind can't possibly make sense of? They turn towards the caregivers, and their entire orientation becomes about the caregiver. It's now fully whatever my caregiver wants. If I can please my caregiver, if I can make my caregiver happy, then my needs will be met. Our sense of self isn't developed. It is oriented towards the other. And so that's why a lot of times people pleasers, we have a hard time when someone says, what do you want? Right? We don't even know what we want. It's very hard for us to even come up with our own ideas or our own opinions. It's not because there's something wrong with us. It's because developmentally, we have been led to believe that the sense of self is going to come from the other. And so with pathological accommodation, we have then been forced to accommodate in order to make sense of the world. This becomes the way that we then understand all relationships. it's not that now we pick and choose people-pleasing behaviors. It's that this is who we are. We are this person. We are the other. We are selfless. We are without self, because our entire sense of self was built on and predicated on the other person's experience of us. And so this idea of then prioritizing ourselves can feel like a complete threat, because we believe that that's going to risk the relationship. That if we are to give ourselves space in the relationship, the other person is going to leave. And that threat is horrible. And we would much rather keep ourselves small, keep our voice small, and prioritize others than to risk the attachment, than to risk losing the important people in our lives. Do we understand that? Does that make sense? Let me know. Let me also know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them live. I want this to be supportive for you. So let me know if you have any questions. Okay. I like to look at people pleasing this way because I think we tend to oversimplify how things come to be. And then we're told that people pleasing, is just a set of behaviors, and then we just need to change those behaviors, and then we try to change those behaviors, but it doesn't work and it doesn't make sense. So then we think, oh, there must be something really wrong with me because changing those behaviors doesn't work, or it doesn't change my orientation towards others. And so I'm letting you know now that if that's you, then that makes sense. It makes sense. There's nothing wrong with you. You are operating as designed. Now, there's another concept that I really gravitate towards and I really appreciate, and it's this idea of a narcissistic extension. So a lot of times what I tend to see, and this has been true for me, is that our mother exhibited narcissistic traits. I use the word narcissism very lightly because I know that it's become very co-opted to mean a lot of things, and we really like to name everybody as being narcissistic if they don't do what we want. But I'm talking about, when I use the word narcissism, a mother who is so in her own world and so busy in her own understanding of herself that she can't make space for a child. And so mothers who tend to be in that narcissism range, who tends to be so self-oriented, the only way they know how to make space for their child is to make the child an extension of self. And so narcissistic extensions means that the mother looks at the child as a reflection of them. And so the child has to perform, has to be an achiever, has to be successful, because if they don't, they make the mom look bad. If we are that narcissistic extension of our mothers, if we were raised in this environment where our sense of self could not be built, because if our sense of self was built, it would be a threat to the relationship. Of course, now we really, really struggle with understanding how we can take up greater space, right? We have a really hard time understanding how, if we have our own voice, if we have our own opinions, that the relationship will still be safe. So that's another concept that may be useful in this topic, in this conversation of people pleasing, is that, having mothers who didn't make space for us, of course, is going to lead us to feel like we can't take up space in the world. And so the only way we know how to do that is by prioritizing the other. So people pleasing is it's a set of beliefs and understandings of ourselves and the world based on developmental needs. It is not this shallow, just set of behaviors that if you were to just change, everything would be better. It's more complicated than that. That's not to say that we're stuck. It's just to appreciate the fact that our psyche is complicated. It's nuanced. And the more that we know this about ourselves, the more we can unhook ourselves from the shame and the anger that we have towards ourselves, and that somehow we're broken or somehow there's something wrong with us. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with you. You are working the way you were designed. One of my clients said something really brilliant to me. They said, you cannot people please and feel worthy at the same time. And I think that is so profound, and that's directly where the worthiness wound comes to play. When we are taught that having our own identity, having our own sense of self is a threat to the relationship, what we tend to do is we tend to then tuck away the parts of us that want that freedom, that want to cultivate that sense of self. worthiness is one of those things. We tuck away, we diminish, and we pretend like we don't really need to cultivate our own sense of self. And then we let that we let that lie go on for so long that we start to internalize that that's the reality, that we really don't need our own sense of self, that we're totally fine as people pleasers. But there tends to be like a nagging voice within us telling us, actually, I think who you are is really important and you need to take up space in the world. And so when we cut off parts of ourselves, we start to disintegrate. We start to break down. We're no longer an integrated whole. We are now an individual that has defenses and masks of people pleasing. And inside we have this absolute fear that we're going to be found out, that there's something really bad and wrong with us. And that's our shadow selves. And so we try to tuck that down as much as possible. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work. And we kind of are left with this feeling like there's something really wrong with us. Yeah. That's the worthiness wound, right? The worthiness wound is something that did I just say that with an accent? The worthiness wound. The worthiness wound is something that we tuck away. And it happens in that split of now we have to be this false self. We have to be this person that is pleasing to our parents as opposed to who we really are with our myriad of complexities and feelings, etc. And, as we continue into adulthood, what happens? We continue to live our lives as if other people are more important than us. And we tend to have this sense that there's something really wrong and broken with us. That's the worthiness wound. And so they both go hand in hand. The same is true for perfectionism. I talked about that on my Instagram post today. Perfectionism is another said defense that's very similar to people pleasing, where we expect ourselves, if we can be perfect, we will be loved. That's another defense. Comparing ourselves to others obsessively is another defense, that if we can hide ourselves and just look at others and see how others are doing it, then somehow we're going to figure out what's right and next for us to do. All of these stem from that split where all of who we are wasn't allowed, and therefore we have to suck it down. We have to push it down. The worthiness wound is born from that. And so now it's very hard to untangle between the two. And oftentimes they play off of each other. There's something wrong with me, so let me keep people pleasing. But as we keep people pleasing, then we continue to exacerbate this sense that there's something wrong with us, and it goes on and on and on. And so there's got to be a different way. We've got to be able to break through the cycle. And the simple answer is we have to develop a different sense of self. We have to develop a sense of self that's grounded in our wholeness, that's grounded in a prioritization of our needs and our desires and our wants. And this prioritization does not mean that it comes at the expense of others, but it's a whole radical belief shift that all of who we are is allowed and that there's unlimited space that we get to take up, because when we take up space, it doesn't take away from someone else's. That's the narrative that we've been taught, that if we take up space, it means that we're risking the relationship. When really the belief system that we are now being invited to internalize is that when we take up space, we're actually giving other people permission to take up space as well, that there's more than enough space for all of us, and that our needs are important. And so, okay, so then we get right to how do we do that? How do we develop a sense of self? I wish there was a short answer. I wish it was super simple. I mean, this is why I'm leading my program, Worthy Women Rise, because it's not so simple and it's nuanced and it's complicated. And we all have different backgrounds and different lived experiences we have to take into account. But I will say this. One of the best ways that we can develop a sense of self is to give ourselves permission to access anger. Because in order to people please, in order to diminish our sense of self, we also have to downplay our anger. Because anger is an alarm system. Anger tells us when our boundaries have been violated. Anger tells us when one of our values is not being played out. So in order to people please, in order to allow other people to bulldoze our boundaries, we have to suppress and diminish our anger. Our anger is holy. It's one of my favorite emotions because it's so important to our sovereignty and to our sense of self. When we give ourselves permission to feel anger, we're giving ourselves permission to have boundaries. We're letting ourselves and the other people around us know that who we are is important. Now, I'm not saying anger equals yelling at people or hurting people or abusing people. That type of expression of anger is actually not feeling anger. It's releasing anger. And that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about sitting with, recognizing, naming, and being with our anger and being able to express it in a way that can be heard by other people. Because when we cut off our anger, we cut off our vitality. When we cut off one of our emotions, we're cutting off all of our emotions. In order for us to experience more joy, more pleasure, more play, more all of the things that we want, we also have to give ourselves permission to experience the full spectrum of the human experience, including anger. I don't like to view anger or emotions as negative and positive. I think that shit's it's bullshit. There is no positive or negative thing about any emotion. They're all good. They're all important. They're all valid. They all need a space. We have to stop with this narrative that certain emotions are accepted and certain emotions are bad. And if we are enlightened, if we are good people, we don't experience certain emotions. This is how we continually perpetuate the good woman trope, which is patriarchal. It's, problematic in many systemic ways, but mostly it has been used as a weapon to keep women down. Because if women are so distracted by trying to be the good girl, to be protected, then they're not thinking about how they're being violated and how their boundaries are being crossed. Anger is really important. Anger grounds us in what is true. When I gave myself permission to experience anger and to feel anger and to release that anger, I'm not saying unleash it at people. I'm saying release it in a way that can be heard in the world. For example, screaming in my car, right? Or punching a pillow, or having a very direct conversation with a friend or with a colleague, whatever. When I allow myself to experience anger, I also am giving myself permission to unhook from this belief that other people are going to save me. I start having my own back. I start recognizing that I don't need other people to save me because I will save me. I got this. People pleasing is believing that, is being taught that other people are the answer. Unhooking from people pleasing is a really holy endeavor of saying, I got the answer. I'm allowed to feel embodied here in this space, in this moment, because I am full and I am enough. So one of the best ways that we can unhook from people pleasing is to give ourselves permission to feel our anger. Now, what does that look like specifically to you? I don't know. For me, it has meant some physical movement that has been helpful for me. My voice, that has been really helpful for me, unleashing my anger through screaming, through gurgling noises, to just making vocal expressions. That has been really helpful for me. Shaking, releasing it from the body has been really helpful for me. But I don't want to say that, I don't want to just stop there. I want us to think about also how we can then express our anger in a very healthy and grounded way to other people. Because it's not always necessary when our boundary has been violated to have a conversation with other people, but that's a whole other thing for a whole other day. However, I think sometimes we can bypass some of the anger by saying, okay, I'm going to go in my car, I'm going to scream, I'm going to have that relationship with anger, and then that's it. No. Anger is an action-moving emotion. It is propelling us towards action. What action is anger asking you to take? What is the reactive action it wants you to take? And what is then the grounded action that anger wants you to take? See if you can sit with the anger in your body. See if you can experience the anger in your body and then notice what it wants you to do. And I'm not saying necessarily do it, but I'm saying be aware of it. And if anger keeps coming up in the same situation over and over and over again, there's probably some action to be tending to. Now, one of the things that tend to come with anger is this narrative that, well, anger is just sadness, right? Like underneath anger is just sadness. So we just need to feel sadness. I don't like that narrative. I think that there's a lot of emotions that go hand in hand, that often go together. Joy and excitement tend to go together. But could we say that underneath excitement is always joy? Maybe Maybe not. I think that sometimes when we say that sadness is what's underneath anger, again, we're invited to then bypass the anger. When anger is its own valid emotion, and you are allowed to have as long as you need with anger as possible. For some of us, it's easier to feel sad than anger. And for some of us, it's easier to experience anger than sadness. That's for you to decide, for you to investigate, for you to notice that within yourself. And then whatever emotion you have a harder time sitting with, make sure you're giving yourself space to sit with that emotion. But none of that is saying, don't give yourself permission to feel anger. Let yourself feel the anger. Let it bubble up in your body. Notice what action it wants you to take. Be with it. Practice marinating in it. And then take those actions. So it's important for us to be very mindful that many of us have disowned anger, and the way that we have justified disowning that anger is by telling ourselves that we can't control our anger, right? Like anger is uncontrollable and we're scared that we're going to hurt people. We probably may have seen anger come out and it wasn't helpful. Like we saw our mother or father or a caregiver, an uncle or an aunt be very angry and hurt people. And we decided that we don't want to do that. We may have been experienced or been a victim of or watched physical abuse happen and decided that we never want to be that way. And so then we suppressed our anger. We'll always find reasons that are very justified for why we should cut off parts of ourselves, because it's the self-fulfilling prophecy. We're going to continue to look for evidence for why we can't trust ourselves. And it's always going to feel really justified. So I want to be really clear here that those expressions of anger, hurting somebody, yelling at somebody, hitting people, those are not healthy expressions of anger. Those are unhealthy expressions of anger. And I'm definitively not saying that those are what we were talking about here. No. What we are talking about here is being able to cultivate the capacity to sit with our anger, expand our capacity to sit with that anger, and then be able to communicate that anger clearly if the situation is appropriate. But the more that we give ourselves permission to experience anger and then to communicate it appropriately, the more we start to unhook ourselves from this need to prioritize other people over us. And then the beautiful thing that starts to happen is it then becomes a balance, becomes a dance between the other human and us. It's no longer whose need is first, but it's their need, then my need, then their need, then my need. And it becomes this beautiful dance of two humans rather than this idea that you have to prioritize your needs or they have to prioritize their needs or you have to prioritize their needs and there's no space for both. Something really cool starts to happen when we develop a sense of self away from up-leveling other people at our expense. We start to feel more spacious in our decision-making capacities. We start to feel like we are entitled to be alive. We start to cultivate a life that we deserve, and we start to feel deserving of it. You know, people-pleasing is a prison that is given to us, right? Like we're put in that prison as a child, and then we perpetuate it as adults. It's so painful to realize the ways in which we maintain our own prison. Because in many ways that we are a victim to really unfortunate circumstances. And then on the other hand, now we're adults, we get to choose something different. We don't have to stay stuck in the same problematic pattern and dynamic that went on in childhood. We now get to look at what's another way that we can relate to ourselves and others. Yeah? I love this comment. When we're talking about anger, I ask myself, I am mad. What am I afraid of here? I love that. And what's beautiful about that question is that we start to be able to identify the wounded places within us that anger is attempting to protect. That's wonderful. Again, anger is a sign that a boundary has been violated. And so being curious about what has been violated. What am I perceiving has been violated? This is a really important thing I talk a lot about on my platform, that emotions are data, not direction. Emotions tell us that we're perceiving something is happening, not that something is actually happening. And that's why it's important for us to be really mindful in the ways that we express our anger. Because just because you feel anger doesn't mean that something is happening. It means that you're perceiving that something is happening. And so the more that we can distance ourselves from that and be curious to what's coming up within ourselves, now we start having more space to decide, is this really what's happening? Do I want to respond to this? Or is this a projection of what I imagine is happening based on my other experiences. Emotions are data. They're information. They're telling us a lot of things. The more that we can give ourselves permission to experience anger, the more information we're now allowing in. Information that before we weren't allowed to experience because we weren't allowed to experience anger because we had to people please. Yeah? This is all wonderful. The more information that we can allow in, the more we can discern and do something differently. And this is really, really, really powerful. This is one of my favorite things, talking about people pleasing, because I see it so clearly in my life. And it's, it's not to say that like it's a destination that once you stop being a people pleaser, then you'll never have to worry about it. It's so cemented in who we are that it takes work, it takes a commitment. But it can be really beautiful to be on this journey, because we start to recognize that when our sense of self isn't derived on other people's opinions of us, we are so much more free to be the full extent of who we were born to be. And that can be a really beautiful thing, because I think us as humans, we're just this expansive, delightful soul wanting to express in the human body. And the more that we can get out of our own way and let ourselves express, the better our world is, the better we are, the better our relationships are. And the more capacity we have to cultivate intimacy, the more the capacity we have to develop a sense of being seen and being heard. Communication feels easier and more doable. We're able to navigate complex situations, challenges, conflict without making everything be so personal, right? Part of people pleasing is that everything feels really personal. Like a person's opinions of us is all about us. When, the truth is people got their own shit and they're probably projecting all their stuff onto you. It's not to say that some of the stuff that they're saying about you isn't true or doesn't, can't be useful. But most of the times people's reaction of us has very little to do with us. But we take things very personally because we have to. If our entire world is oriented towards the outside, towards others, any information we get towards others is going to have to be taken very seriously. And it's a yo-yo ride, right? Like it's a roller coaster ride, and it's exhausting to be on. It's exhausting to be constantly conforming ourselves to other people, hoping that we'll get like some scrap of love. Like, come on. We're so much better than that. We're so much more deserving of that. We're so much more worthy of that. We're worthy of more than just other people's scraps. We're worthy of our own fullness and other people's innate fullness. And whole people coming together creates more wholeness. And that's what I want for myself personally. And I think that that's what we all want too. So let yourself feel angry. Let yourself feel angry. You don't have to end it. You don't have to stop being angry. Anger is really potent. And you'll notice that like all emotions, when you give yourself permission to feel it and feel it fully, it doesn't last that long. Because anger, you can't live in anger forever. It's exhausting to the nervous system. It's not very good for the body. That's why we have to stop suppressing it so much, because it's living there. We're just not aware of it. We got to bring it out. We got to feel it so we can move through it, so that it doesn't change, like take over our whole lives. No emotion is really that good sitting there for forever. We've got to let that move through us so that we can be a clear channel for all of our emotions to move through and move out, and let us be in like a symbiotic dance with life. Because like I said, emotions are information. They're telling us so much about what is happening in our internal world. I have a theory, and like I'm still formulating it and I'm still putting it together. But in my life, I've seen that one of the best ways that I've developed a sense of self, coming as a narcissistic extension of my mother, one of the best things that I've done to cultivate a sense of self was to be with my emotions, because my emotions is me. My emotions are not my full identity. I am more than my emotions, but my emotions are telling me so much of who I am. So the more that I can learn to attune to and listen to and be with my emotions, the more I start to develop and understand myself. And there it is, cultivating a sense of self. So anger gets to be that portal, and it gets to be really good, and it gets to be wonderful and fun. So that's all I have for all of you. Thank you for showing up on this Instagram live. It's just such an honor to be here. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask, and I'll answer it at another time. And if all of this piques your interest, I deeply invite you to join Worthy Women Rise, where we're going to go into this much more depth. You can learn more at worthywomenrise.com. Doors close Wednesday, or when our 2 spots are taken. To all my people pleasers out there, you got this. You got this. People pleasing isn't a prison sentence. We get to experience a sense of freedom from it. We don't have to be trapped in it forever. You just got to start making some conscious choices. And your anger is one of the best ways to take you there. Okay? Sending all of you my love. Now talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thaís Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.